And welcome. Thanks for being here. My name is Michael Keegan, and it's my honor to be able to introduce a friend of mine, whose bio, I believe, might be available back there. It's quite lengthy. He's an all-around good guy. Dr. Gordon Edwards, professor of mathematics at Vanier in Montreal. And Gordon, I see, has been at this for 30 years on the nuclear front, confronting uranium mining up in Saskatchewan back in 1977, and was instrumental in preventing uranium mining in Labrador and Newfoundland. He's been a consultant to many governments, world-renowned expert on nuclear issues. He has acted as our expert testimony on MOX, which was plutonium, when they wanted to bring plutonium through Michigan. And he is well steeped in everything nuclear. He's the founder and president of the Canadian Coalition for Nuclear Responsibility. There's a tremendous web page to go to get all kinds of documents on things nuclear. Just last year, Dr. Edwards received the 2006 Nuclear Free Futures Award in the education category. And he just comes back to us from, he was a keynote speaker at an international conference on nuclear waste in Stockholm. He's a globetrotter, tireless, sleeps very little, and he's been a mentor to the anti-nuclear movement for 30 years. And with no further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Gordon Edwards.
Thank you all for coming. That was a beautiful song and prayer at the beginning. I think it sort of sets the stage for reminding us that, you know, the earth is sacred and that we do have a responsibility as custodians of this planet to really think hard about what we're doing. And we are trying to do that. It's not easy. I think it's encouraging that people are now a lot more worried about climate change than they used to be a few years ago. That's a good sign. It's a sign that the conscience is awakening, the consciousness is awakening, the desire to do something about it. The difficulty is that when people are scared, they sometimes jump at the wrong option. And one of the things that I believe is that nuclear power is the wrong option for a couple of reasons, which I will show you some of the background. One of those reasons is that it's no way going to solve the global warming problem. It simply cannot. And nobody in the nuclear industry actually says it will. What they do is they let people believe that it will solve the global warming problem without actually saying it. They know darn well that it can only make a marginal contribution to our energy demands, such as they are. And so we're going to be left with a whole lot of nuclear power plants and a whole lot of nuclear waste and a whole lot of plutonium and a whole lot of problems for many generations to come and still have an unsolved global warming problem. That's the difficulty here. It's holding out, I believe, a false hope. Now, what I'm going to do this morning is to just run through some aspects of the nuclear age that I think it will help people to sort of put this thing into context and to see the special problems that are caused by going down the nuclear path. There really are three nuclear ages. The first nuclear age is the age of radioactivity, and that was over a century ago, 1896, when Henri Becquerel discovered radioactivity. And in fact, the unit of radioactivity is called the becquerel. He discovered this by putting a lump of uranium ore, which he got from mountains in Czechoslovakia. He was interested in phosphorescent, things that glowed in the dark. But most things that glow in the dark require sunlight. You know, you put them in the sunlight, and then after a while they glow. He thought that uranium was a similar type of material because he heard that sometimes it glowed. But he put it in a drawer and left it there for weeks with no sunlight. And then later he put a photographic plate wrapped in very thick brown paper. And when he developed the photographic plate, he found that there were rays, there was light exposure on the plate. So it appeared to him that there was some kind of invisible light that was very penetrating, that was able to penetrate through this brown paper and expose the photographic plate. And he was the one who discovered radioactivity. He did not know at that time that the actual energy that's causing that invisible light is due to the disintegration of individual atoms. the spontaneous disintegration of individual atoms. And in fact, that's what a becquerel means. A becquerel means 1 disintegration every second. So for example, in Canada, we have a standard, which is rather disgraceful, for drinking water. And the standard is 7,000 becquerels per liter. So imagine having a liter of water in front of me here. I hold this liter up, and there's 7,000 disintegrations every second going on in the water through the radioactive hydrogen that's in there. That's called tritium. That's what a becquerel is. So when you hear the word becquerel, just think about what it means. Now, an older unit of radioactivity is the Curie. This is Marie Curie. She was a young woman from Poland who came to, penniless really, to France in order to study, and there she met and married Pierre Curie. She was interested in what was causing this invisible light that Becquerel found. So just within a couple of years, she had managed to crush this rock and dissolve it in acid and separate it chemically. She was a chemist. She separated out chemically the uranium, because the uranium, it was felt, was the source of the radioactivity. But she discovered, to her amazement, that in fact, once the uranium was out, yes, it was radioactive, but what was left behind was far more radioactive, much more radioactive. And this led her to think that there must be other radioactive materials there which people haven't noticed. Uranium is not the only one. It's not even the most dangerous one or the strongest one. So she discovered 2 brand new chemical elements for which she won the Nobel Prize. One was, she named after her native country of Poland. She called it polonium. And the other was radium. And what she did not know at that time was that polonium and radium are actually transformations of the uranium atom. So when the uranium atom disintegrates, it transforms itself into other things. And for this reason, I've come to call uranium a kind of a shapeshifter. It changes its appearance. It changes its identity. But it's all from uranium. So the uranium actually produces the polonium and also the radium. Now polonium, but these 2 substances, polonium and radium, are among the most toxic substances known to science. Polonium, for example, you may remember polonium-210 is the murder instrument that was used to kill the Russian spy Alexander Litvinenko in London, England. Now that polonium-210 is exactly the same polonium-210 that Marie Curie found, except that here it was produced in a different way. Here it was produced in a reactor, where she found that it also occurs in nature as a so-called decay product of uranium, naturally occurring. But polonium-210 is an incredibly toxic material. In fact, if you go on the internet and do a little research, you'll find out that it's many billions of times more toxic than cyanide, which is the fastest acting lethal human poison known. Billions of times. A little crystal of polonium-210, the size of a small grain of sugar, would be enough to kill 1,000 men the way Litvinenko was killed. That is, within 30 days, dying an agonizing death. The polonium actually attaches itself to the red blood cells, and as it goes through the body, it visits all the soft organs and disables them one at a time. So it's a very particularly horrible kind of poison. But that's polonium-210. Now, people are sometimes amazed at how could anybody possibly carry this stuff in order to poison Litvinenko without killing themselves. The fact of the matter is that radiation is actually a misnomer. It's better to talk about atomic radiation, which is not really the same as other types of radiation. It's also called ionizing radiation. And in fact, one of the most characteristic things about it is it's not always made up of rays at all. We have 4 types of radiation from radioactive materials, atomic radiation, and I like to call this radioactivity rather than radiation. We have alpha, which is not a ray, but a particle that's given off when an atom disintegrates. It gives off a little piece of shrapnel. And the heaviest piece of shrapnel that's given off is called an alpha particle. And that does a lot of damage to living cells, but it doesn't have a lot of penetrating power because it's not really a ray. That's not what Becquerel saw going through the thick paper. This won't even pass through a thin piece of paper, the alpha particle. But it's very damaging for living cells. Beta is also slightly more penetrating, but only moderately so. It can only go through a few centimeters in soft tissue. It's also a particle. It's not a ray. The only one that's really a ray is gamma rays. Now gamma rays are a lot like X-rays. That's what Becquerel observed. Becquerel observed the gamma rays. What Madame Curie found was she found that, in fact, uranium and radium and polonium are all alpha emitters. They don't give off gamma radiation themselves, but there's other materials which give off gamma rays which are also produced by the disintegration of uranium. So it's a bit complicated. You can understand why there's a lot of confusion over this. Now, there's another type of radiation called neutron radiation. That's another particle, but it's very, very penetrating. You may remember some of the oldsters here might remember about the neutron bomb. The neutron bomb has the virtue, of killing people but not damaging buildings. Well, that's neutrons, because neutrons go right through solid structures. But when they hit something that has a lot of water, like a living thing, then they deliver their energy in a lethal way. And so neutrons are very damaging to living things, less harmful to non-living things. Now, radium is also a very poisonous material, although Madame Curie was so excited when she discovered it. And it was used for good purposes as well as for foolish purposes. It was used, for example, to shrink tumors, dangerous medical tumors. So it was used in medical therapy. But it was also used as a kind of a novelty, and an expensive novelty, but a novelty. And these young women are among thousands of young women, mostly in their teens or very early 20s, who were hired to paint dials with radium paint. And this was back in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And they worked, for example, in New Jersey there was a plant like that, in Germany, in Montreal there was a plant like this, called a radium dial factory, where they painted these radium dials. Well, it turns out that many of these women, by 1920s, they had started to develop terrible problems with their jaws. There was a dentist who published a publication saying that these women were dying of a disease which he called radium jaw. Their teeth were falling out, they had horrible infections, and they had very severe anemia, which in some cases were fatal within a short period of time, and in other cases could be slowly brought under control. And their jawbones were so porous that when the dentist tried to work on them, they would spontaneously fracture. And so he called this radium jaw. And later, just about a few years later, these women started dying of bone cancer. And bone cancer is quite a rare disease. And there was another forensic pathologist named Howard Martland who investigated the autopsies of these women and found that all their bones had tiny amounts of radium in them that they had ingested, and the total amount of radium in their entire body was only a few micrograms. A microgram is almost invisible to the naked eye, and in fact very difficult at that time. Something which was only in microgram quantities was chemically impossible to identify. The only way you could identify it was through its radioactivity. But they had ingested very small amounts of radium over the years of dial painting, and it had proven lethal to many of them. By the way, many years... Yes, when they went in the morning, after cleaning their brushes the night before, when they went in the morning to start their job, they would often lick the brush, the clean brush, in order to put a nice sharp point on it so that they could then dip it in the paint and paint the dials. And it was through that contact with the clean brush, because it wasn't really clean, it still had residues of radium, tiny residues, which would get into the saliva and into the mouth and into the body. They found that the bones of these women, even though it was only a few micrograms, every bone in the body was radioactive, and they found that you could take any bone and put it on a photographic plate overnight, and it would take its own picture. So in the morning you come in and there'd be what's called an autoradiograph. So these materials are really byproducts of uranium, natural byproducts of uranium. Everywhere you find uranium on the earth, you find these things too, because they're part of the family. You know, when you buy uranium or when you acquire uranium, you don't just acquire the one thing, you acquire the whole family. And up in the Northwest Territories, back in the 1930s, actually about 1930 exactly, Gilbert Levine from Ontario discovered a radium deposit. And radium at that point was selling for $100,000 a gram. It was the most expensive thing on earth. And so he opened a radium mine, and he hired these native people, the Satu Dene, who had lived around Great Bear Lake for thousands of years to act as coolies to carry sacks of radium concentrates. At that time, there was no market for uranium, but radium was a hot commodity, and so they were selling the radium. And they carried these radium concentrates on their backs in these burlap sacks. They were never told there was any danger whatsoever. Sometimes the bags would rip, and they'd be covered with yellow powder. They were not even told to shower or to wash or to clean themselves thoroughly or to avoid, contact with this material. It was just basically a job carrying this powder. Here you see the old sacks rotting on the rocks near the site of the Port Radium Mine, as it was called. And that's one of the Satu Dene people standing over there. The women were not told not to reuse these sacks, and being a recycling and frugal, they would take the sacks and reuse them, and thereby bring the contamination into their homes as well. The village where these people live is now known popularly as the Village of Widows because so many men died from handling this material. Now, many people think that before the splitting of the atom in the Second World War, that we really didn't know about the dangers of radioactivity, but that's not true. We already knew about polonium, we already knew about radium. And in fact, this is these two men, Satu Dene men, that monument back there is on the site of the Port Radium Mine, and it explains that this mine was first of all a radium mine, but then it was converted to a uranium mine in order to supply uranium for the first atomic bombs that were built during the Manhattan Project. Now, these two men are holding a publication of the Canadian government dated to 1931. It's an enlargement, of course. And what it says is, I've got it in red there, the ingestion of small amounts of radioactive dust or emanation over a long period of time may have serious consequences. Lung cancer, bone necrosis, and rapid anemia are possible diseases due to deposition of radioactive substances in the cell tissue or bone structure of the body. So, I mean, this was well understood by 1931. And the way it was understood, of course, was because of the dial painters and other victims of radiation in the early 20s and 30s. This is a uranium miner, Navajo, from the southwest United States. He has lung cancer. And one of the things they knew as early as the 1930s was that people who worked in these underground mines, even people who had worked over a period of 400 years, 400 years ago, believe it or not, there was a document published by a famous scholar which commented on the strange lung disease which was killing almost more than half of the men who worked in the mines in Czechoslovakia and Germany. The Erz Mountains, they were called. And by the 30s, they knew the cause. But by the middle of the 19th century, they knew that it was lung cancer that they were talking about. And by the 1930s, it was well documented that it was radon that was causing this lung cancer. So this was not something that wasn't known. However, once again, when they started mining uranium, they basically didn't tell the miners of the hazards, which were already well documented. It wasn't considered to be necessary, and in fact, it wasn't very helpful. You have a more willing workforce if you don't keep dwelling on dangers. Now, here is a picture of lung tissue. This is an enlargement of a slide of lung tissue of an ape. And the reason I have this slide here is because the slide has been covered with an emulsion so that when alpha particles are given off, it leaves a track. And what you see there, that star-shaped object in the middle there, is actually a time exposure over 48 hours, showing the alpha particles that are given off by an invisibly small particle of alpha-emitting material in the lung. And that's what happens inside the lungs of uranium miners. What happens is that over 48 hours, you see those rays coming out. Well, if you can imagine, if you left it for another 48 hours, it would be impossible to make out anything. It would be just a big black blot. The danger is here that there's only about 50,000 cells in that radius. But if those cells are damaged and able to reproduce, those are the ones that might go on to kill you. The ones that are killed outright, the cells that are killed outright are not a problem. The body can replace them. But the cells that are damaged and able to reproduce, they can develop into cancers. Typically, it takes 15 to 20 years. That's called the latency period before the exposure to radiation results in a visible, detectable cancer. If a uranium miner, for example, went to a doctor and got a medical checkup, there would be no indication that he was sick. Even so, the damage might have already been done that would lead to cancer decades later. The British Columbia Medical Association describes this as a gradually flowering crop of radiation-induced cancers. And that's what we've seen in all the populations of uranium miners. We've seen that, especially after they retire, that's when you see the cancer rate really mounting. So this is, although radon is a gas, of course you've heard about radon in the homes and so on. It's important to realize that radon is another transformed version of uranium. Every atom of radon comes from uranium. So uranium, which is often described as being only mildly radioactive or not that dangerous, in fact, you have to realize that uranium is always transforming itself into other things, and these other things are really genuinely deadly. Not that uranium is harmless. Uranium is also dangerous, a lot more dangerous than they let on. But the byproducts are much worse. And radon is another byproduct of uranium. And although it's a gas, so you breathe it into your lungs, but inside your lungs, its byproducts are solids. And those are the byproducts of radon. It only has a 3.8-day half-life. So it means that when you breathe the radon gas, you're also breathing in its byproducts, disintegration products. And those things stay in the lungs. As a matter of fact, you'll notice the purple ones, those are polonium isotopes. There's polonium-210. The thing that killed Litvinenko is what you get from radon. So that's why radon is so deadly. Radon is actually a delivery system for polonium. Now there's also 3 isotopes of polonium. There's polonium-218, 214, and 210. Believe it or not, 218 and 214 are even more dangerous than polonium-210. So that's why radon is considered to be a significant and national public health problem. Now, when uranium mining started to take place in earnest, of course, when they found a market for uranium, then they started digging huge amounts of rock out of the ground in order to extract the uranium. But just as Marie Curie discovered so many years earlier, that when you extract the uranium, you are dealing with a radioactive ore body. And this man is walking away from the pit. That pit, by the way, is in Canada. It's in Saskatchewan. It's called the Key Lake open pit mine. And this man is just walking down the road. And on the side of the road there, just like you might have a traffic sign or a weather sign, we've got a radiation sign. And the radiation sign tells you what's the low and what's the high of radiation levels that particular day. And it turns out that if you translate those numbers, it's 75 microrem's per hour. Turns out that's about 7,000 times background radiation. And what they're talking about on this sign here is just the gamma radiation. They're not even talking about the alpha radiation. Because the alpha radiation you can't really measure until it really gets inside you. You have to be very close and use very special techniques to measure the alpha and the beta. Inside the mill, they crush up the rock. Here's the mill, and they produce something called yellow cake. In fact, there's a spill right there. And if this picture was in color, you would see a bright yellow coloring where it's spattering. That man is on his way to fix it. But all they're removing from the ore is the uranium. All the rest of that stuff is left behind in the tailings. That's a wall of tailings up at Elliott Lake. It's about 30 feet high. And behind that wall is a lake of tailings. It's about 70 million tons. And 70 million tons of radioactive sand. And in the radioactive sand is all the radium, all the polonium, and all the radon generating material that was in the original ore, because they don't want that. All they want is the uranium. So they separate the uranium, they leave all this stuff behind. 85% of the radioactivity of the ore body is in those tailings. And the reason for that is because we have this whole decay chain. Uranium, when it disintegrates, turns into an isotope of thorium, which turns into protactinium. And then down here, look, there's the radium-226. That's what killed the dial painters. And then if you go just a step further, radium-226 is what produces radon. So radon is, again, one of those chains of descendants, the decay products of uranium. And down here we have the polonium isotopes, which are the deadliest component of the radon gas. And all of this is left behind because when the uranium is taken away, you're still left with this thing called thorium-230. Let's just take the uranium away. And you see the thorium-230 there has a half-life of almost 80,000 years. And what it means is that thorium-230 being left in the tailings, it continuously regenerates all the other things below it for actually for hundreds of thousands of years to come. So the tailings remain dangerous literally for hundreds of thousands of years. We have in Canada over 200 million tons. You have in the United States over 200 million tons as well. And this is a permanent legacy. The question is, how do you keep 200 million tons of radioactive sand out of the environment? Not an easy job, and something which has not always been done, of course. You've probably heard of some of the accidents. Now, when they refurbish some of the old tailings, this is a situation in Elliott Lake where they've actually gone in and done an environmental assessment, an environmental refurbishment of the old tailings, and they've organized them in different levels, covered with water. And this is what it looks like from the side, from a schematic point of view. They've got these different levels where the water passes from one level to the next. The reason for the water is to prevent the radon gas from being given off in enormous quantities, because radon will just pour off of that thing, the tailings, at a rate about 10,000 times higher than normal, because of all the radioactive material in the tailings is producing the radon. Before it was in the hard rock. When it's in the hard rock, most of the radon never gets out. But once it's ground up into tailings, it gets out quite easily. So they have that water cover there for that purpose. But you look at this, and you look at the filtration systems they have and so on, and you ask yourself, is this really going to last for 80,000 years? Who is going to maintain this? I mean, the pyramids of Egypt are only 5,000 years old. And this thing has a supposed lifetime of what? A couple of 100,000 years? So that's the problem. Even the most modern things, here's a modern one in northern Saskatchewan. All those little buildings around the circle are actually monitoring wells. You see them all? There's a whole lot of them. And these monitoring wells are there to monitor if any radiation is seeping out of that central pit. In the central pit, they have a long pipeline, and at the end of the pipeline, in the middle of the pool, is a barge which floats around on top of the water, depositing radioactive tailings into the water, which sinks to the bottom. And now they have these monitoring units all the way around to detect any leakage. And if leakage does occur, these wells are equipped with pumps that can pump the water back in. Again, probably the most advanced tailings containment system on the planet of the Earth at the moment. And yet, one asks oneself, 80,000 years? Really? You know, are these pumps going to actually work when they're needed? Or are they going to be rusted out? Who's going to maintain these things? Who's going to go in, oil them, make sure they're working? And we've also seen examples recently where even with such a sophisticated, apparently sophisticated monitoring system, we've seen a situation just last week, in fact, in Port Hope, Ontario, where the contamination just passes in between two of those monitoring wells and you don't detect any problem at all, and yet it's leaking away. This happened just recently in Port Hope. They had to close down a factory for that reason. Well, now, I don't want to take too long, but I think it's good to sort of know what we're talking about. So let me just continue. The second nuclear age was about 50... Now, the first nuclear age is still going on. These ages are not... one age does not replace the other, it just adds to the other. So the first nuclear age is the age of radioactivity. The second nuclear age is about 50 years later. They discovered that uranium had a use that they could make use of. And that is that uranium undergoes something that no other naturally occurring radioactive material does, and that's called fission. And here is a model of the uranium atom. This model is down in Oak Ridge, where the uranium for the first atomic bomb that was used on Japan, the Hiroshima bomb, this is where the uranium was prepared for that bomb. This model of the atom of uranium reminds us that uranium is the heaviest naturally occurring element on Earth. And it was discovered about 200 years ago. It was actually named after the planet Uranus, which had been discovered around the same time. And later on, when they found plutonium, they named it after Pluto. So these names came from the celestial objects. But when they discovered uranium, they really didn't have any use for it. It was just one of those other chemical elements which they hadn't yet figured out what to do with, until they discovered something really remarkable about it. And that is that it can undergo a process called nuclear fission, where the atom splits and gives off a tremendous amount of energy. And the thing is that that process can be controlled, unlike radioactivity, which is not controllable. And when the atom splits, here we have a monument in the ex-Soviet Union. It's a monument to the splitting of the atom. And what it shows, in the front you have a figure of a man who is Vladimir Kurchatov, who was the father of the Soviet atomic bomb. And behind him you have this monument which shows a uranium atom at the instant of splitting. And you will notice that the semicircles indicate the energy that's given off, and the two hemispheres are the broken pieces of uranium atoms. Now those broken pieces of uranium atoms are other transformations of uranium. And it turns out that there are this time not just a dozen, as there were in the case of disintegration products that we were talking about, but in this case there are hundreds of byproducts of uranium through splitting. Every one of those broken pieces of uranium atoms is a new radioactive substance which generally doesn't exist in nature. These are called strontium-90, cesium-137, krypton-85, iodine-131, all those names that you may have heard thrown around. What they are really is broken pieces of uranium atoms, and they're called fission products. Fission products. Now, the fission products are millions of times more radioactive than the uranium itself. So if you're counting becquerels, remember being disintegrations per second? There's literally millions of times more becquerels after fission than before fission. Now, of course, the first use of fission was to build atomic bombs for World War II, as you know, and to use them on cities, which is the ultimate terrorist act. I mean, what could be more of a terrorist act than blowing up an entire city full of people who are non-combatants for the most part? So that's always a very thorny issue because, you know, it's a sore point. Did we really do that? And should we have really done that? And were there other things that could have been done? And will it be done again? Et cetera, et cetera. All of these things, of course, come to mind. But when the bomb explodes, in addition to just the force of the explosion and the huge burst of penetrating radiation that it gives off right away, there's also the fallout, which is the fission products largely, which get spewed up into the cloud and which descend for decades and even centuries afterwards. In fact, we still have fallout coming down today from the atmospheric testing that went on in the past. Now, the important thing to realize is that these are radioactive materials. They're not invisible rays, but they're actual materials. Imagine that you had literally hundreds. We've got 211 of them listed on our website. You can go and look at them. That's not a complete list, however. So you have over 300 radioactive materials, and each one of these materials is a different chemical. So as a different chemical, it behaves different chemically. It behaves differently in the body and everything. For instance, here we have iodine-131. Now iodine-131, just like regular non-radioactive iodine, it goes to the thyroid gland. We have iodine in our salt to prevent goiter, and it works well. Radioactive iodine also prevents goiter, but it provokes a lot of other diseases like cancer of the thyroid, and in young children it can also cause mental retardation, stunted growth, and a host of developmental problems, especially for infants or for embryos. Then we have, for example, cesium-137. That's a big, important one. This one goes to the muscle tissue, and as a result, it's one of the main things that renders food unusable because of fallout. That's what happened after Chernobyl. The main reason why food was not usable after Chernobyl was because of the cesium-137 as well as other things. Then there's the strontium-90, which goes to the bones, the teeth, and the milk because it's chemically similar to calcium. So when the body gets strontium-90 in the diet, the body thinks it's calcium and just puts it where the calcium goes. And so it gets passed on to nursing infants and causes bone diseases and leukemia and so on. Here's a man who, a real live human who was in the Navy, who was witnessing one of these atomic tests, who got damaged by fallout, and many years later he developed a host of problems. He died a few weeks after this picture was taken. You can't see in the picture, both his legs have been amputated at this point, but this was the result, years later, of exposure to radiation while he was watching an A-bomb test. At the time he felt fine. The only thing he thought peculiar was the fact that he was out there swabbing down the deck of the ship after the explosion, wearing only shorts and a t-shirt. And as he looked down the end of the boat, he saw other people dressed in moon suits from top to bottom, and using strange equipment to measure. And he thought, God, that's strange. Why? How come they're dressed like that and I'm dressed like this? Well, I guess he found out, unfortunately, that he should have been protected also, but he wasn't. And here's a man, this is part of an industry ad. He's probably an actor. And it's part of an ad from the Canadian Nuclear Association, and it's called Small Wonder. And he's holding up a uranium fuel pellet and explaining how we can get the power of the atom, the power of fission, out of uranium in order to produce electricity. Now, what they don't tell you in the ad is that if those are fuel bundles in the front, we use those fuel bundles in CANDU reactors. The uranium pellets are inside the fuel bundles. And the idea is that we could use the uranium to release its energy more slowly in order to generate electricity by boiling a lot of water, using the heat to boil a lot of water, and then use the steam to turn the turbine and generate electricity. So the idea was that there's so much heat given off by this fission reaction that maybe we can utilize that. What he doesn't tell you, though, is that once those bundles go into the reactor, they then come out loaded with fission products. And as a result, they are literally millions of times more radioactive than before they went in. And one of those bundles would be enough to kill any human being in about 20 seconds at a distance of 1 meter, just by the penetrating radiation alone, once it comes out of the reactor. So although the industry likes to call it spent fuel, which sort of gives you the idea that it's really exhausted and can barely make its way out, in fact, it's better to call it irradiated fuel, and it's better to realize that this stuff is very, very dangerous. In fact, these are the most dangerous radioactive objects on the face of the Earth. They will never be handled by human hands again. They'll only be handled by robots. That's the way they are handled.
It contains plutonium.
It also contains plutonium, but that's the third age. It's important to understand fission products because plutonium is not a fission product. Now, this is building the Darlington reactors. They built these reactors, of course, in order to get the energy out. This is the face of a CANDU reactor before it ever started up. And the man who's standing there would be unable to stand there if the reactor had started up because the radiation would be too intense. He'd be killed. As a matter of fact, the radiation of the fission products is so intense that even if the reactor is completely shut down, then the heat generated by the radioactive elements is enough to melt the fuel at a temperature of over 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's called a meltdown. And many people think that you can stop a meltdown by shutting the reactor down. No, it's not true. Shutting the reactor down does not prevent the meltdown. Even after it's shut down, you still have to keep cooling it for a lengthy period of time because it will spontaneously melt unless the heat of the radioactivity is removed. And that heat cannot be turned off. As a matter of fact, these are some people who suffered consequences, of course, when reactors do melt down. This man, his name is Barney Paulson. He had hundreds of operations for cancer all over his body. We helped him out to get a pension. He finally did get a pension. But he was one of 600 military men called to Chalk River to clean up after an accident in 1952, where a piece of fuel about this long, it was metallic fuel in that case, caught fire and burned and spread fission products all through the interior of the reactor building. Once that stuff is released by burning, it then is like, it's like tobacco smoke. It just hangs in the air. And it stays in the air for weeks. So that when they try and decontaminate it, it's very difficult. A lot of it sort of sticks to surfaces, but they can't even get it off the surfaces. When they try and scrub the surfaces, it turns out that no matter if you scrub it day after day after day, you can reduce the amount of radioactivity, but it just kind of plates. It's almost like electroplating. It just plates to the surface. So they had a lot of trouble cleaning up after that accident. This is a woman named Joyce Karate. There was a 3 Mile Island accident in 1979 where the top few feet of the core melted until they finally noticed what was going on. It took them 2 days to notice that it was melting. And they finally prevented it from melting all the way down, but there was quite a lot of melting.
What year was that?
That was 1979.
17.
Did I say 1979?
13.
No, 19. Did I say 69? I'm sorry, it was 1979. Thank you for correcting me on that. What she's complaining about here, she's expressing her opinion at a public meeting. And the public meeting has to do with decontaminating the reactor building of radioactive gases by letting them out into the atmosphere. And she is objecting to this and saying, you know, why don't you do the more expensive thing, which would be to freeze them cryogenically and ship them off-site? But that costs more money. So they went ahead and they released the radioactive gases in little puffs, controlled puffs, over a period of many days and weeks. Years later, there was a court case in which this action was found to be illegal by the authorities. But of course, it was already done. This is a locker full of radioactively contaminated reindeer meat. This is in Lapland in northern Sweden, where you have reindeer herders. You know, the reindeer are domesticated and they do harvest them for meat. But this particular reefer is full of carcasses which are too radioactive for human consumption. They are contaminated with cesium-137 from the Chernobyl accident 20 years ago. And as a matter of fact, if you go on the internet again, you will find that there are still farms today in northern England and in northern Wales where the farmers cannot sell their sheep meat because of radioactive contamination from Chernobyl 20 years ago. But that's still the case. Gradually, some of those farms are slowly getting back on their feet, but it takes a long time. Now, when the fuel comes out of the reactor, as I told you, it still generates a lot of heat and enough to melt down. They have to put it underwater for at least 7 to 10 years, because if they don't do that, it will damage itself through overheating. And when it damages itself, it damages us. Because when it damages itself, it gives off the radioactive gases that are inside, of which there are a lot. And there's also radioactive vapors, iodine-131 vapors, cesium-137 vapors. So they have to put it under cooling water for at least 7 to 10 years. And this is one of those spent fuel bays under construction. You can see the dimensions of it. They're quite large, but necessary. This is the same bay when it's full. Somehow it doesn't look as impressive when it's full. But there it is, and that's full of spent fuel. And of course, although they designed the reactors to work for 20 or 30 years, or actually they said 40 or 50, but it never has seemed to make it. They don't seem to make it that long. But even though they designed the reactors to operate for 20 or 30 years, they only designed the pools to hold 10 years worth of spent fuel, which talk about your rocket science, eh? So this, of course, and the reason why is because they were supremely confident that somebody else would figure out how to dispose of the waste. They never bothered thinking about the waste very much because they were so excited about thinking about the power and thinking about whether it was the bombs or whether it was the electricity or whether it was the future. That was the inspiring thing. That was the thing that got everybody excited. Who wants to be a trash carrier or looking after the garbage? So it was something that just never really got properly attended to and still hasn't been properly attended to. After 10 years in wet storage, it can then be put into dry storage. These are dry storage containers, but they're still extremely radioactive and there still is heat being generated, and these things are air-cooled. So they could not really be put underground because underground they would not get the air circulation they need. And so inside those flasks, you would have damage being done to the fuel, and that's not good. Those men can stand there. I'm one of those men, by the way. Those men can stand there because these flasks are extremely heavy. They weigh about 100 tons each. And most of that is shielding to stop the radiation. Only a small portion of that is the actual irradiated fuel. Now here we have a picture of the Bruce nuclear complex, which is the thing that we're most concerned about today. Because Bruce, and this is only a portion of the Bruce nuclear complex, Bruce is situated right up on Georgian Bay. It's got 9 reactors, of which some are shut down. One of them is defunct. It's the Douglas Point reactor.
Would you tell us where that is in relation to here?
Okay. Well, here we have, you see this peninsula up here? This is the Bruce Peninsula right here. It sticks up between Lake Huron and Georgian Bay, right? And on that spit of land there, on the Lake Huron side, that's where the Bruce nuclear complex is.
Little lower, little lower.
A little lower,
Yes.
down around here.
Lower the right point.
Lower?
Center.
Oh, down around here, okay, yeah, right, okay, so. Geography, I never was very good at geography. There we are, so there it is, and you know, it's right there, it's sitting right there, and 9 reactors worth. All the irradiated fuel is right on site, and if any big accident were to happen, where is this stuff going to go?
Is that the one that they're recently, we just heard at a water talk, that they were going to put buried underneath the Great Lakes, the waste, underneath Lake Huron?
Yes, well this is what...
Is that the one?
This is one of the things that everybody should be very concerned about.
Right.
Because it turns out that
Caseville.
the Bruce nuclear complex here, which is situated in this, in terms of large cities, it's reasonably remote because there aren't large cities there. There's a lot of people, but they're in smaller communities. And as you well understand, these communities become dependent upon the industry. They become dependent on the
Right.
jobs, dependent on the payroll, and so on. So you have really like a company town to a large extent. Not that there aren't opponents, of course, not that there aren't people who fight it, but it's largely a company town. And the thing is that the last thing they want is shutdowns, because that would mean layoffs and unemployment and so on. So they want to keep these plants going. And right now they're doing a lot of refurbishment work. Now when they refurbish the reactors, they have to take a lot of radioactive crap, pardon the word, but they have to remove a lot of radioactive crap from the building, and that becomes new radioactive waste. And some of this junk, this radioactive junk, is very, very large. For example, they have the steam generators, which are each one of them about 100 tons each, and those are going to be removed. They become radioactive waste too. So the question is, what to do with all this radioactive waste? Now, I have some pictures here which I'll show you of what they have been doing. Here, for example, is some cells in the ground for holding contaminated materials. Now, these are radioactively contaminated materials, which would be like mop heads, rags, clothes, filters, all kinds of things which get contaminated and which become radioactive waste. Now, not only the waste generated at Bruce, but the waste generated at all the other nuclear reactors in Ontario come to Bruce. So you have here the central repository for the entire Canadian nuclear program within Ontario, which is really almost everything. There's only 2 other reactors, one in New Brunswick and one in Quebec. But the 20 reactors, which are the main reactors, are right in Ontario. And all their stuff goes here. Now, in addition to the contaminated materials, you have what's called activation materials. Now, activation materials, you understand contamination, of course, would be materials which have come into contact with fission products and so have become permanently contaminated and are not really usable for any other purpose. In addition to that, there's something else that happens inside the reactor. It's called activation, neutron activation. And the way that happens is that when the uranium is splitting, it's giving off things called neutrons. Neutrons turn out to be the main vehicle for splitting uranium atoms. So inside a reactor you have these subatomic particles called neutrons flying around. Now when a neutron hits a non-radioactive material, like this cup for example, then the neutron will very often be absorbed by atoms in the cup, and that atom, which was not radioactive before, now becomes radioactive. That's called activation. So what happens is non-radioactive materials get activated. They're actually turned into radioactive materials by neutron bombardment. And that's what happens to all the structural materials in the inner workings of the nuclear reactor. So pieces of equipment, pieces of pipe, even pieces of machinery that may be used can become activated. And that means that that material, even if it's made of the finest stainless steel, it can never be recycled and reused. It has to be disposed of as radioactive waste. Some people have described it as the ultimate throwaway society, the ultimate extension of the throwaway society. So these are activation materials. Those little pipes that are poking their noses up there are just little places to monitor what's going on down below under the ground. Here we have a radioactive incinerator. Those are bad news. They have one of these at Bruce too. And what they do here is they take a lot of radioactively contaminated materials which are combustible, and they incinerate them in order to reduce the volume, which of course produces radioactive smoke and radioactive contamination of the equipment and so on and so on. So the radioactive incinerators are always bad news. They have one of those at Bruce. And even the construction materials, as I was saying, here's the face of a CANDU reactor again. Before we looked at the fuel that was in those channels. Each one of those channels has those fuel bundles inside them. But you also have, look at all the pipes around the sides there. Here's a bit close-up of the pipes. These are called feeder pipes. Well, these feeder pipes feed the water, the cooling water, into the core of the reactor. They become intensely radioactive through activation as well as contamination. So that when they try and refurbish these reactors, even after they take the irradiated fuel out, it's still enormously dangerous for the workers to deal with this material. They have to have heavy shielding to do it. Now the third nuclear age I was going to mention about is the plutonium economy. Let me just sort of go fairly quickly through this, because I think the main thing we want to think about is what's facing Michigan and what's facing this area in the Great Lakes. There is concern. The reason I showed you about the uranium mining is because there's a lot of exploration going on for uranium mining right now, and a lot of this exploration is taking place up in the Upper Peninsula. So there's concern about uranium mining possibly getting into Upper Michigan. If that happens, the trouble is that those radioactive sands and slimes, they're also called, the really fine portions are called slimes. That's the technical name for them. These sands and slimes, they become a real ecological time bomb. And being up in the northern part of the peninsula is not really much help because they can so easily get washed into the lake and contaminate the lake. We've already had, the International Joint Commission has already pointed out that the major #1 source of radium contamination of the Great Lakes is from the mines on the Ontario side, the Elliott Lake mines. Well, you might be joining the club there if you're not careful. The second thing, of course, is what you were just mentioning about the idea of what to do with all this junk that they've got already and all the junk they're going to have by the work they're now doing in disemboweling the center, the core of the reactor in order to put in all new pipes and everything. But when they do that, they have to take out these old pipes. And let me tell you, those pipes themselves are very, very radioactive, and they remain dangerous for themselves tens of thousands of years. So they're not as radioactive as the irradiated fuel, which is called high-level radioactive waste, but they are the next most radioactive thing that comes out of the reactor, are those pipes. So they want to say, well, where are we going to put these things? And they're thinking, and this is what's going on right now, there's a process already launched, they're thinking of digging down into the sedimentary rock, which is the type of rock they have there, and about 500 meters, and having underground caverns and putting all that junk down there. They call it a deep underground geological repository. Now, this is obviously a worrisome thing, and it should be a worrisome thing for all of us, because these wastes really do have an effective half-life, effective lifetime of tens of thousands of years. And of course, if they're going to put it down there, who is ever going to take it out again? Are they ever going to remove it? And what happens with erosion, with global warming, with earthquakes, with what have you? What we are doing here is we're thinking about putting right beside the Great Lakes, the greatest source of fresh water in North America, we're thinking of putting this repository. It's like your own local Yucca Mountain. You know, it's like having your own little local Yucca Mountain, so you don't have to feel that you're left out, right? Now the thing is that this waste repository, although they use the word low and intermediate level waste, that's what they call it. It's a repository for low and intermediate level waste. Don't be fooled. These are not really low level radioactivity. They are, in fact, many of them, the very same materials that are in the irradiated fuel. They're just less concentrated. In the irradiated fuel, that's the mother lode of these radioactive materials. But these materials have been contaminated. For example, they have filters. When they circulate the water through the spent fuel bay, they have to filter it, and those filters become radioactive waste. You know what a vacuum dust bag looks like, right? When you take it out. Well, think of any filter you have ever seen. When you throw it away, what does it look like? Well, the thing is that stuff is radioactive junk. And it's the same radioactive junk that was inside the irradiated fuel. It's just been trapped on the filter. So when they call it low and medium level radioactive waste, it's just a way of patting you on the head and telling you, oh, this is not high level radioactive waste. Well, the only thing they call high level radioactive waste is the irradiated fuel. And you know what? If they get away with this, that might be next. Because they have been trying in Canada already for about 20 years, as you know about Yucca Mountain. Well, they've been trying in Canada for over 20 years to get the idea of geological disposal. They call it disposal, even though we don't even know what that means, because the human race has never disposed of anything. But they talk about geological disposal of high-level radioactive waste. This is probably one step in that direction, because if they can get away with it for the low and medium level waste, then they can say, oh, this is a piece of cake. Now all we have to do is just put the high level waste down there too. And job done. So I think this is a very important question that we all have to address, because unlike some decisions which can be rolled back, this is the kind of decision that really can't be rolled back. You know, you can't wait like 10 years until after it's a fait accompli and then say, oops, you know what, we shouldn't have really done that. Let's roll back the clock and do it over again. Now's the time, I think, that we really have to sound the alarm bell and get people really realizing what's going on. It's very important. Now, I'll just go more briefly through the rest of this. The third nuclear age I call the plutonium economy. It turns out that uranium, as I told you before, is a shapeshifter. Not only does uranium in nature change itself into polonium and radium and radon, which are very dangerous materials, but through the help of mankind, humankind, we have constructed these machines which break the uranium atoms into hundreds of pieces, and we get hundreds of fission products, which we've talked about. We also get innocent bystanders, which are the activation products. In addition to those, however, there's something else, and that is they're called transuranic elements. These are elements which do not exist in nature. They're man-made elements which are, in fact, heavier than uranium. And the principal one of these that we all know about, or have heard the name of, is plutonium. If you go looking in the universe for plutonium, if you go looking all over the earth for plutonium, you will never find it, except where there has been a fissioning reactor or an atomic bomb which has been able to produce that plutonium, because plutonium doesn't exist in nature. Now, this is the amount of plutonium. Actually, this is a glass paperweight. The man holding this glass paperweight is Richard Rhodes, who wrote the book The Making of the Atomic Bomb. He had this glass paperweight manufactured to his own specifications because it is exactly the same size as the plutonium ball that was used in the Nagasaki bomb. That's how much plutonium you need to destroy a city. This plutonium weighs about 6 kilograms. It's rather heavy. They can now do the same explosive power with about 3 kilograms. They've learned how to make the weapons more efficient. And the danger is that anybody who gets their hand on 6 kilograms or 3 kilograms of plutonium has the potential, with the right help, to make an atomic bomb. And so hence the problem of what do you do with this material to keep it out of the hands of criminals, terrorists, or just plain old madmen who happen to be leading countries. Now, to make matters worse, you might say, well, that's a serious problem, having this plutonium around because of the military. But to make matters worse, this man, who represents the nuclear industry, at least in the ad, who's holding up this little pellet saying, small wonder, is really, he's not saying this in the ad, but what we know is that in the future, those pellets might not be made so much of uranium, but of plutonium. That they want to use plutonium as the fuel of the future because they know they're going to run out of uranium. And that's why the uranium prices have gone up so high, by the way. The uranium prices have gone up so high because uranium is not nearly as plentiful as they let you believe. The only reason uranium has been plentiful is because nuclear power has been unsuccessful. If they actually succeed in building tens of thousands of nuclear reactors, they're going to need plutonium because they're not going to have enough uranium. Uranium is going to give out around the same time the oil gives out. Now, if you want proof of this, the proof is very simple. Just look at every single country that has a large nuclear program. they all have a plutonium program. France does it routinely. They reprocess and extract the plutonium to reuse it in fuel. India does it, Russia does it, Japan does it, Britain does it. So we have lots of proof that this is what everybody really has in mind. And George Bush is now thinking about lifting the ban on plutonium reprocessing that was imposed by President Carter. So we're talking about another Brave New World aspect here, where instead of just taking the uranium from the mine and then refining it and then fabricating it into fuel, putting it in the reactor, and getting this horrible spent fuel, the irradiated fuel, they want to make it into a cycle. And that means that you have to close the cycle. When you close the cycle, there's only really two technologies here. One before it goes to the reactor, which is called enrichment, and the other after it goes through the reactor, which is called reprocessing. And this one produces, well, it can produce fuel, or it can produce bombs. That's why, for example, there's so much fuss about Iran building an enrichment plant. Any country that builds an enrichment plant has the ability to enrich to a low degree, which allows you to fuel a reactor, but it also allows you to enrich to a high degree and make bombs. You can't make a bomb directly from reactor fuel, but if you enrich it high enough, you can. Now, reprocessing is taking the irradiated fuel and using robotic equipment, dissolving it in nitric acid, separating out the plutonium from all the rest of the junk. The plutonium is only about 1%. And you separate out that plutonium, leaving all that radioactive waste that we were just talking about before in a liquid form. And then you got the plutonium, and again, you can either use that as fuel or you can use it in bombs. Now, the thing about plutonium is it does not have to be enriched. It's already 100% enriched at birth. So that's why plutonium is the most worrisome. It's even more worrisome than the other one, the highly enriched uranium. The first bombs were made, this is a model of the Hiroshima bomb, which was made from highly enriched uranium. And this is a model of the Nagasaki bomb, which is made from plutonium. Those two things, enriched uranium and plutonium, are the only things you can make atomic bombs from. And they are also the only things that you can fuel a nuclear reactor with. If you want to fuel a nuclear reactor, nowadays, even the Canadian reactors are going to start using enriched uranium. They're turning away from natural uranium. In the future, any reactor will have to be fueled by either enriching uranium or by producing plutonium. Both of those lead to the possibility of bombs, and that's a big, big worry. Now, I'm not going to go through all this because this is too much. It's just saying, what is uranium enrichment? Uranium enrichment, there's two types of uranium in nature. The most abundant type is not the type that fissions. It's the U-235 that fissions, not the U-238. So what enrichment means is basically taking, increasing the concentration of the U-235, and that can only be done by discarding the U-238. And that's where you get the enriched uranium from. The U-238 is called depleted uranium. So there you got the depleted uranium. Well, look, I think that I should wrap this up. I just want to go through something, just something about the age of sustainability, because I think this is what we're all pinning our hopes on, is beyond nuclear, the age of sustainability. What we've just seen is the kind of scenario, the path that the nuclear industry and those countries that are promoting nuclear power want to take us down. And it's a scary path, and in fact, nobody seems to have the answers for where this path really leads, particularly when you start getting into the plutonium economy. So what is the alternative? Well, the first thing is we have to realize that our problem is not really getting more energy. Our problem is learning how to use it more wisely. Now, this is a graph that was prepared in 1975 by Amory Lovins. This was actually in a book that we published. It's on our website. He published this. This was the path that people were predicting was going to take place, where you would have, you wanted to phase out oil and gas simply because you were going to run out of it, not because of global warming. They weren't talking about global warming back then. But you were going to phase out of oil and gas because the amounts were going to become diminished. You're still going to have to use coal and lots of it, and you're going to have to use nuclear as much as you can build in order to take up some of the slack. And that was called, what Amory Lovins called the hard energy path. And he said that in fact what we should be doing is something more like this, which is the soft path. He said, we know how, through technological means, to prevent that enormous growth in energy waste, and even with a very healthy growth in GNP and business and comfort levels, you can actually reduce your levels of energy and still have a lot of all the amenities of life. And if you implement this type of energy efficiency, then the soft path would allow these soft technologies to come in. Solar energy, wind energy, geothermal energy, wave power, all these different things that have been talked about over the years. And so that's really the promise that, that's the vision that many people have in terms of not pursuing nuclear. The key to this is really taking seriously energy efficiency. Because if you don't take energy efficiency seriously, then it's impossible for renewables to make a proper contribution. But once you have energy efficiency, then it becomes relatively easy to provide those lower demands by means of renewables. In fact, President Carter, when he was president, set up a thing called the Solar Energy Research Institute, which was canceled by Reagan within days of Reagan being inaugurated. But the Solar Energy Research Institute was given a job by Carter of seeing whether renewable energy, in particular solar energy, could meet 25% of US energy needs by a certain date. I forget that date, I think it was 2020 or something like that. And the report that they finally published, that had to be released through a congressional committee because it was banned, they weren't allowed to print it. But the report, when it was finally released, was quite an interesting document. It's called A New Prosperity, Towards a New Prosperity. And they said it's actually quite easy to meet 25% of US energy needs through solar energy, but the only way you can do it is through energy efficiency. That what you have to do is you really got to go all out on energy efficiency, and then solar energy can really kick in and make a big difference. Well, it turns out that in 1989, Amory Lovins, this was in 1989, in Montreal we had something called the Green Energy Conference, and Amory Lovins was pointing out then that we were already within the boundary of what he had predicted, that our energy demands in the United States were actually, whereas the hard path predicted that we would be using something like 120 quads, that's quadrillion BTUs, that we'd be using 120 quads of energy by 1989. In fact, we were only using about 80 quads of energy. So we had already reduced our demand from 120 to 80 just in that period of time. And I just checked this morning, as a matter of fact, I went on to a friendly internet service provider who just happened to have Wi-Fi at Mike Keegan's house, and I checked the figures for today, and the latest figures are 2006. And guess what they are for 2006? 71 quads. These are the official government reports of energy used in the United States. 71 quads is even slightly lower than this. So actually, it's 2007. We're actually still within this envelope that Amory Lovins was predicting back in 1975, compared with what the hard energy guys were telling us was going to happen, which was this. In other words, we would have been way up over 200 quads. So I think we have to have a sense of history. And we have to realize that in the past we've often been told that we've got to build more nuclear reactors, we've got to do this, our whole civilization is just going to grind to a halt if we don't do this or don't do that. A lot of this is hype. A lot of this is hype, and it's not based upon really good thinking. Now, if you take a look at the so-called nuclear renaissance, here is a report that was issued just in 2006 by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You may know about this panel. This panel is an international group of scientists who are set up by the United Nations Environmental Program and the World Meteorological Organization to give the best advice they can to the United Nations and to the nations of the world on climate change. And they said, this is working group number 3, they said, given the cost relative to other supply options, nuclear power, which accounted for 16% of electricity supply in 2005, now 16% turns out to be 2.7% of total energy, because electricity is only one slice of the pie. So if you look at the total energy pie, that's about 2.7% of total energy. And they said that if we really invest in nuclear and a few $100 billion to build new plants and so on, that it can have an 18% share of the total electricity supply in 2030. 2030 is 25 years later. In other words, that's a quarter of a century. In a quarter of a century, nuclear power can increase its contribution to electricity from 16% to 18%, and that represents only 3% of total energy. So in other words, we're talking about increasing nuclear share from 2.7% of total energy use to 3%. And people are saying, we got to build nuclear power plants. The point is that the next 25 years are the crucial ones. We can't be wasting our time building nuclear power plants that aren't going to make that big a difference. We're spending all of our money and all of our political capital, as well as all of our investment capital, on a dead-end solution. It's not going to solve the problem. Now, it's true, just to be honest, it's true that once these plants are built, they will kick in and make a larger contribution after that 25 years. But as every climate change scientist will tell you, it's the next 25 years which are the most important. And we know what to do in the next 25 years that's going to have a much bigger impact on global warming, energy efficiency. Studies done a long time ago show that $1 invested in energy efficiency will displace 7 times as much greenhouse gases as the same dollar invested not just in nuclear, but any centralized electricity supply option, whether it's a huge dam, whether it's a coal-fired plant, whether it's an oil-fired plant, you name it. So we already know which way to go. And of course, they also add that even if the contribution was increased from 16% to 18%, safety, weapons proliferation, and waste remain as constraints. Well, those are pretty big constraints. And not only big constraints, but also very expensive constraints. Think of the money that has to go into each one of those things in terms of trying to control it. I think I will, let me just sort of say something about the waste, because I think this is something you should be aware of. Now, please don't be confused. I'm talking here about the high-level radioactive waste, which is the irradiated fuel. So what I'm saying here doesn't directly apply to the low and intermediate level waste, but thin edge of the wedge. You know, you have to think about the thin edge of the wedge. That if they put the low stuff there, they could very well argue to put the high stuff there later. Now, just the constraints of radioactive waste. They want to put it in geological disposal. This is actually a photograph of the underground workings in Manitoba, where they built an underground shaft to experiment with the idea of putting radioactive waste down there. When the Manitoba government got wind of what they were doing, well, they knew what they were doing from the beginning, but when they got a little pressure from the citizens, they passed a law saying that it's illegal to import radioactive waste into Manitoba for the sake of putting it down there. So they said, you can go ahead and do the research, but don't think you're going to put the waste down. Now, even after the waste is buried, this is from an Atomic Energy of Canada Limited document. Remember I told you about how the waste continues to generate heat because of the fission products. Well, even 70 years after it comes out of the reactor, if it's buried underground rock, the temperature of the waste is indicated here compared with the rock strata which surround it. And because there's no mechanism for removing the heat, that heat spreads through the rock. And after 4,400 years, this is what the temperature distribution is predicted to look like in the underground rock. And then after 8,000 years, this is what it looks like. So AECL has a sequence of these diagrams which go up to about 50,000 years, and they say that after 50,000 years, you're back almost to where you started. So they call this period of 50,000 years the thermal pulse. That's the thermal pulse. The trouble is, of course, while that rock is heating up and cooling down, what kind of cracking is going on, what kind of shifting, what kind of pathways are being established that might not have been there originally. Yeah.
What kind of units are those?
They're degrees. Those are degrees in Celsius. So they're just talking about degrees Celsius there. Now, here's another graph. This is from the Ontario Royal Commission on Electric Power Planning in 1978. They looked at the toxicity of irradiated CANDU fuel over a period of 10 million years. This scale goes from 1 year out of the reactor to 10 million years out of the reactor. And the top line indicates the total toxicity which actually diminishes up until about 100,000 years, and then it goes back up again because of internal changes. Radioactive changes are always going on in the fuel. And so you actually get inbreeding of more dangerous radioactive materials after 100,000 years. So now these are the fission products. So the question you might ask is, well, if the fission products are going way down here, what accounts for this? That's mainly the transuranic elements, the plutonium, the americium, the curium, the alpha emitters. These are mostly alpha emitters, and they're very, very toxic. But they are not fission products directly. That includes the plutonium, for example. Incidentally, this graph indicates the toxicity in terms of how much water you need to dilute it to the maximum legal limits for drinking water of contamination. And at the left corner, where it starts, that's about equal to, well, it's not exactly equal, it's a bit less. It's about 3/4 of the volume of Lake Superior. And that's only for 1 year's production of 1 CANDU reactor. So they're talking here about 1 year's production of irradiated fuel from 1 CANDU reactor. At the moment it comes out of the reactor, it would take about 3/4 of the volume of Lake Superior to dissolve that to the maximum levels of contamination which you could then drink. I'm sure you'd be happy to drink it. Now, here's my little thing that I did in Sweden earlier this year. It's a conceptual idea of why the nuclear renaissance with geological disposal doesn't make any sense. Here's the problem. Without geological disposal, we have this reactor indicated by the X, and each one of these dots represents 1 year's worth of spent fuel. Now obviously that's dangerous to have this spent fuel around, and after 4 years you've got more, after 8 years you've got more, after 16 years you've got a lot of waste. But the color is changing because it's beginning to get a little cooler, a little less radioactive, but not a whole lot. But you'll notice in the graph that I showed you, the first 10 years are the worst. So the first 10 years are the worst, but it continues to accumulate, and of course the industry says, wow, we've got a problem. People don't want nuclear power because the nuclear power plants have all this waste beside them. They're not going to put up with that. We've got to have a solution to this. So here's the solution: geological disposal. This is going to solve the problem. So here we go. First of all, after 2 years, well, actually there's no difference because we can't do anything with it. It's too hot. It's got to stay in the pool. After 4 years, still no difference. That stuff is still too hot. After 8 years, still no difference. After 16 years, well, even after 16 years, I've talked to nuclear scientists and they say 16 years is still too early to put it underground. But let's suppose that they're geniuses and they can put it underground after 10 years. Then they still have 10 years worth of irradiated fuel which is unburied. And that's the worst stuff. That's the stuff which is most radioactive, which is most hot, and which has most of the vapors. Most of the cesium, for example, is in the first 10 years. And most of the iodine-131 and so on. So, even though you bury all this older stuff, the catastrophe potential at the surface still remains as long as the reactor continues to operate. The only way you could eliminate this would be by shutting down the reactor and keeping it shut down for at least 10 years. Then it all becomes old, and then eventually you can all theoretically move it underground, even if that's the right thing to do, which not everybody agrees. But they're talking about a nuclear renaissance. In other words, they're talking about building more reactors. So if you build more reactors, then what you do is you actually have more and more unburied radioactive waste, even with geological disposal. So as you expand the nuclear industry, even if you bury this stuff as quickly as humanly possible, and even if the burial is safe, you still have an ever-growing inventory of unburied waste here, and that's an enormous catastrophe potential. In other words, you haven't solved the problem. You have not solved the problem. So my contention is that, once again, this is a question of optics. The nuclear industry, when they say this solves the problem, what they mean is this solves their public relations problem. It does not solve an actual safety problem, nor does it solve a health problem. What it does is maybe it solves their public relations problem.
How deep are they going, and what kind of rock is it? Yucca Mountain, was that igneous, metamorphic, sedimentary?
Well, I'm
Sedimentary.
not a geologist, and I don't have all the details about Yucca Mountain, but Yucca Mountain was essentially an old volcano, wasn't it? Am I wrong about that?
Yeah.
Was Yucca Mountain an old volcano?
It's volcanic tuff.
It's volcanic, so therefore it would be volcanic tuff, right?
Igneous. Okay, so what about?
Here they're
What
talking-
about the Great Lakes? That's all
That's sedimentary.
sedimentary. And how deep are they going?
About 500 meters they're talking about going there.
Aquifers
600.
travel in that area.
I know. Look, this is crazy. This is crazy. They haven't even studied sedimentary rock. All the studies they've done in Canada have always been on granite. And they've always talked about granite, and not only just ordinary granite, but granite plutons. A pluton is like a giant tooth, an intrusion into the granite formation, which has a certain integrity. So they were talking about doing it inside a granite pluton. But now they're all of a sudden they're going for this sedimentary rock right beside Georgian Bay, right beside Lake Huron. It doesn't really make sense. But the industry is basically saying, what are we going to do with all this crap? And they figure that leaving it on the surface just calls attention to it. Also, of course, it exposes them to questions about possible acts of terrorism and so on. But I think more than anything else, it just simply calls attention to the fact that they have these huge, voluminous volumes of radioactive waste. You know the cute little things I showed you before? Those cute little things in the ground and the field with the pipes coming out? Well, they can't do that with a huge steam generator which weighs 100 tons. Where are they going to bury that, right? And what about all these thousands of tubes? They're going to be taking thousands, many thousands of irradiated tubes out of the reactor of different diameters, pressure tubes, feeder pipes, calandria tubes, all of them radioactive garbage. What are they going to do with all that stuff?
5,600 tubes in one.
56 in one reactor,
Yeah.
5,600 there. You see, I wasn't lying, thousands for sure. And multiply that by the number of reactors they're working on.
480, but 560, 5,600 pressure fuel bundles.
Yeah, those aren't
But
tubes, no.
480.
No, but if you take 500 pressure tubes,
Yeah.
and then 500 calandria tubes, right away you've got 1,000.
Yeah.
Then you take the inlet feeders and the outlet feeders, there's another 1,000, so you got 2,000 right there.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's basically the presentation. I hope you found it useful. And it'll just set the stage for later. Just 3 questions, I'll try and give short answers. Why do people point to France as such a success story in nuclear power? France is not as much of a success story as you might think. But France, first of all, France built nuclear weapons. I mean, that was how France got into the nuclear age. And they learned how to do that in Montreal because they were part of an international team studying how to make nuclear weapons, how to make the plutonium for nuclear weapons in Montreal, Canada. After the war, they went back to France and they produced their own bomb. At the same time, they started building reactors for electricity generation, and they have never really clearly separated the two. In other words, their electricity for peace program and their electricity for bombs program has always been closely integrated. Now that means that you can shuffle a lot of money around, because when you're doing a defense program, you know, or they call it defense, right? When you do a defense program or a war program, there's all kinds of money available for weapons of war. And that money can be used for the civilian program or for the military program. I have never seen a proper cost accounting of the French nuclear program. But they have been very successful in building a lot of reactors, in appealing to French pride to overcome resistance, so that most French people are quite proud of the fact that their country is a nuclear power and therefore important in the world. And they also have been generally supportive of the nuclear power industry. But they have had their breakdowns. They tried to build what's called a super phoenix, which is the breeder reactor. That was supposed to be the jewel in the crown, and they failed. They were not able to get it operating. It turned out to be a fiasco. They've had some other breakdowns that have happened recently. You might have heard about the plants where the rivers are getting too hot to cool the reactors, and they either have to shut the reactors down. In some cases, they had to have people out there hosing down the reactors to prevent them from overheating, because the rivers themselves get too warm on these hot summers to actually keep those reactors going. There's other countries in Europe that have had to shut reactors down for the same reason. I was told by Mike Keegan they had to shut down a reactor on Lake Erie, a couple of reactors, because of overheating of Lake Erie. So it hasn't been an unmitigated success, but they've really put a lot of money into this. And right now they have more nuclear electricity than they can use. So they're selling it at discount rates to other countries below cost. And they're doing this because better to sell it at below cost than to not sell it at all. And so other countries are actually buying some of their electricity, but their program has also had serious difficulties. And right now they're trying to build a reactor in Finland. You might have heard about the French company that's building a reactor in Finland. It's over budget, it's delayed, it's not going well. So, I think the main success of the French program has been they, more than any other program almost, except the Soviet program, has remained secret. They've maintained a level of secrecy that other countries have been unable to maintain.
What do they do with their waste, though, in a small country like this?
They still don't have a disposal for it. They reprocess it, they get plutonium out of it, and then they produce liquid waste, and then they solidify it. They solidify it by glassification. But they don't have a solution for that problem yet. Yes?
With the two charts that were from Lovins, the hard path and the soft
Right.
path, you were talking about quads of energy that are used. There was no evidence on the graph for nuclear usage in the United States. Is that because we get such a small amount?
Yeah, it's too small. It's too small to really make much of a difference on the graph. That's really it.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, you may not know the answer to this, but there was an article not too long ago in the newspapers that there's a new process where they somehow convert some of this polluted material into either glass beads or ceramic beads, which makes it inert and less dangerous in terms of fission and moving it around and storing it. Could you comment that? The other one is, I read a while back that they found a microbe in the pollution at the bottom of the Boston Harbor that actually eats uranium or radioactive material and transforms that into something inert. Are you familiar with those two processes?
Oh, I'm a little bit familiar with them. The second one I don't believe is quite correctly stated, but the first one is the physical form. There has been a lot of work done by different scientists in different parts of the world into getting a physical form, whether it's glass or whether it's something called synthetic rock, or something which you can put the waste materials into a form which is highly resistant to dispersal, even over periods of thousands and thousands of years. And so that's been one of the main concentrations. And these kind of glass beads and so on, the difficulty is that it's not always an easy thing to do that. I mean, how do you take, for example, a 100-ton steam generator and turn it into glass beads? How much energy do you have to use to do that? How do you go from A to B, So although some of these waste forms are quite interesting and suitable for certain types of waste, for example, some of the liquid waste, they could be solidified in glass beads, and that makes them much less available to the environment than they would otherwise be. It doesn't destroy the waste, of course. It just puts it into a form which is more resistant. Now, the other thing you were saying about the bacteria, the important thing that radiation, we don't know really how to stop radioactivity. All we can do, because the atoms themselves are radioactive, so no matter what transformation it goes through, whether it's a chemical change or a bacterial change or whatever, it doesn't change the material. It simply incorporates it into different molecules. So you do have bacteria which can digest uranium, I know that, but that doesn't mean the uranium disappears. It simply goes into the bodies of the bacteria or into the excrement of the bacteria. It doesn't disappear. And it doesn't create inert substances. I think that what you might have is a situation where if you had a tank of contaminated material, you might be able to let the bacteria loose in it and remove a lot of the contamination from the tank, so that what's left in the tank is relatively non-radioactive, but you got a lot of radioactive bacteria there, and they're not going to disappear either, So as far as we know, outside of nuclear processes, there's no way of rendering this stuff harmless or neutral. You can just convert it from one physical form into another physical form. And I think we agreed on 3, so I could answer your question in private, but thanks everybody.